Hello and welcome to everybody for another episode of MEDtalkx. We're broadcasting live on Pendle Community Radio, Awaz 103.1 FM, as well as on our usual channels on YouTube as well as Facebook. So please search for MEDtalkx with an X. And if you want to see evidence that we look better than we sound, please do head on over there. So today's topic is something quite serious. It's always been a serious issue for us all, but I guess it's come to the forefront of our conversation again because of what happened to George Floyd back in US of A. So it's a topic on racism, inequality, as well as discrimination, not necessarily in that order. So we will try to cover these areas, but please, if you do have any comments or questions, please do use our Facebook and YouTube channels. So Faheem, over to you to introduce our guest.
Yep, thank you so much, Mehran, for introducing me. A warm welcome to our guest today, Dr. Siema Iqbal. Siema has been on the show before, just a few weeks ago, and I'm thankful that we didn't manage to put her off coming again. She's a mother, a doctor, British Muslim opinion writer based in Manchester. She's a GP partner and trainer at a North Manchester GP practice and has been working for 14 years. She also does some aesthetics works, and people, the viewers and listeners, may know her from her some of her writings and work in the media. So if you're happy with that introduction, Siema, welcome again to the show.
Thank you for having me back. Thank you, Faheem.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. We want to start with the Black Lives Matter issue then with you today. And obviously, I think you need to be on a different world if you haven't heard of this over the last few weeks. But can you tell us a little bit about what it means to you and perhaps what you think we can do as individuals and just as society at large to show solidarity on this movement?
Yeah, I think this is a pivotal point in history that we're actually living through and witnessing at the moment. And I think it's much needed, and it's shown another light on the impact of racism, both abroad and also in the UK. I know it stemmed from events that happen abroad, but I think it very much reflects what's happening in the UK at the moment too. But I think for us, and for me particularly, and with two children, one age 13, it's so important to show what we need to do to make a difference. It isn't just about, the black square I think many of us put on Instagram, and then you feel like you've done a couple of posts on Facebook and some on Twitter and a bit on Instagram, and you've done the hashtag, and now you've shown solidarity, and that's good. It's good to do that, but I think there is so much more that we can do. I've been thinking about this as time's gone on and been making points more for my 13-year-old, because I think it's important for him to know that what difference he can make at this age as well. So firstly, I think it's not about us, and I remember reading somewhere, there was a very good analogy about, hashtag Black Lives Matter, and someone said, and a lot of people, I did see on some posts people writing hashtag All Lives Matter, and there was a really good analogy I read somewhere, which was, if, for example, you go to a breast cancer fundraiser, you don't go to that fundraiser and start saying, oh, what about bowel cancer? What about this? Or what about that? You do what is needed for that cause at that time. So I think we need to think, at this moment in time, it's about Black Lives Matter, and we need to be doing things like amplifying and providing platform for Black voices. I'm not the expert on it. I have Black friends who are, and it's their voices that we need to hear. I think we are responsible for educating ourselves. So, and in this day and age of social media and Google and so on, there is no excuse for ignorance anymore. You can go out there. There are numerous books. I'm not going to name them because it's easy to find. There are some fantastic books out there, articles, podcasts. Even if you're on Instagram, some of the information that I've read on there about Black Lives Matter and about the history, about police brutality, about racial inequality, about racism, institutional racism, it's all out there. It's just, if you just need to go out there and actually look for the information and read it and educate yourselves. But also, and I'm going to keep coming back to this point about educating your children, because they're the next generation that are going to make the difference. I suppose donate to the right causes. There's a bit of debate around protests, you know, when the protests happen, and, you know, there were some people saying, we're in the middle of a pandemic, you know, why are they protesting? And if you got masks on, you know, and you're social distancing and you're maintaining your 2 meters, and, you know, you can't compare those protests to, say, the Day or people out in parks, you know, mixing. It's not the same. One is recreational, one is people are fighting for their human rights. The two are not comparable in my eyes. And I think if you've got kids, take them to the protests. You know, most protests are safe, and they're well managed, and it's good for children to see, you know, that there are people who are fighting for the same cause as them, and it can be done peacefully. And protests are a good way of fighting for your rights. I know some people are very anti-protest, but I've been on numerous protests. I've taken my children to them, and it's important for them as well. I could just go on, you know, use your vote. In the UK, if you write to your MP, you know, we voted for them, we are their constituents, ask them to raise issues in Parliament, ask them to, you know, table debates. Let's have the conversations that need to be had. Use your own platforms, think about your own prejudices, and just keep listening and learning, because there is so much out there, and we're not experts on it. I hold my hand, you know, I'm not an expert on this at all, but we need to listen to the voices that are.
That's really good.
You've touched on a certain point about these counter slogans, isn't it? So there's obviously this idea about Black Lives Matter, but then you'll see some people, especially in the United States, they will not say Black Lives Matter. They may say All Lives Matter, or, you know, the new hashtag is Blue Lives Matter, referring to the police. What's your feeling about some of these counter slogans? Do you think it's an acknowledgement that Black lives does matter, but so does everybody else? Or, you know, for example, say Professor Goldberg, he actually says this is actually a form of dismissal and denial of the actual problem.
I think, yeah, I'm not going to say that everyone who says this, you know, everyone who says all lives matter is dismissing the problem. I think it'd be wrong for me to say that. I think there are genuinely people that think, okay, Black lives do matter, but we all matter and we're all equal. And I think by saying all lives matter, what they're trying to imply is that we're all equal and we all need to work together as one. And their intentions are not bad, yeah? But this is where it comes into play. Well, you just need to do a little bit more reading to understand that at this moment in time, even though your intentions are good, it's what you need to do to make those Black voices heard and give them the platforms, and not make it about all lives at this moment in time. But for some, I agree, it is about dismissal. It's about just diluting the whole kind of movement, or the whole, you know, everything that's come through, and diluting it and saying, yeah, all lives matter, it's fine. And I think that's what we need to be careful of, and that's why it's important that we stick to it's Black lives that are mattering, and this is what we need to focus on.
Taking that further, Siema, obviously we're all in the medical field, and this concept, you know, we've all been through medical school and seeing the different discriminations and things that may exist in those circles. What do you think proactively doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals can do to actually be enlightened themselves and to enlighten others about this issue?
I think, look, we know that there is, and, you know, I'm a doctor, I've been through the system, the UK system, and I will say there is institutional racism within the NHS, okay? There is, we need, you know, you see different manifestations of this. You've got the racial pay gap for BME, you know, Black and ethnic minority doctors and others. You see the fact that a lot of doctors that are referred to the GMC tend to be from ethnic minority backgrounds. You see that mostly ethnic minority doctors are the ones that will get complained about. They're less confident to speak up. They're more fearful. They're in more precarious jobs, both financially and in terms of position. They sometimes struggle, and, you know, this is a reality, to get through to consultant posts at times. So you know, institutional racism does exist, but until we tackle it, and I think the EHRC are doing an inquiry on structural racism or institutional racism, and they've just announced it a few weeks ago. And I think as part of that inquiry, and I work with an organisation called Every Doctor as well, part of that inquiry should be to look at the NHS. The NHS is one of the UK's largest employers. So if we're looking at institutional racism, we need to look at all employers, and that includes the NHS.
I think there's a lot of safeguards and standards that trusts have to abide by, isn't there? There's the NHS workforce and race equality standard that that publish data on a regular basis, and that kind of pictures how your trust or your organization performs. And I do agree that there is this sense, and it's very difficult to sometimes understand and argue whether this is a conscious bias or an unconscious bias. Because I've seen it through my own kind of journey that people of other ethnicities will actually support people of BME when perhaps they should be voicing and raising concerns themselves. So I do agree there has to be an inquiry, but I do think everyone's got a slightly different opinion on how things go, because everyone's got an individual journey.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, myself, I can say I don't think I've experienced any racism throughout my kind of training and my journey. I haven't. But I do know colleagues that have. So I think, there's both sides out there, but I think in order to support, we need to have safe spaces where we can raise concerns. So if there are concerns about racism or discrimination, there has to be a safe space to raise it at the very least. I think that's a bare minimum, and how it's dealt with is the next issue. But I think at the very least, have a space for people to raise concerns. I mean, we've seen it around PPE, haven't we, recently, and COVID? And, is it that it's a fear of speaking out about PPE, and that's one of the things that people are talking about as to why so many doctors from a Black and ethnic minority background may have, disproportionately been affected by COVID, because they've been put in hot zones, where they're more exposed to COVID patients, not with adequate PPE, because we know what happened with the whole PPE shambles, and then have been too fearful to speak out. So I think it manifests. So if we don't provide that safe space, these are the sort of outcomes that we see. And yet again, on the other side of the coin, I've had a great, journey through medicine and become a GP and work in a multi-diverse area that I do. And I've not personally experienced problems, but I do hear of students and other doctors that do.
And I guess taking this, moving it further for more of the general public, we know from some of this data now, Siema, that people from a South Asian background or ethnic minorities, they're more likely to die. That's quite clear. I think it was shown Bangladeshis twice as much as other populations, and there seemed to be a bit of a peak table, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians, this sort of, obviously people of the black. I mean, what do you make of that? People are looking at that in different ways. Some are trying to look at perhaps genetic causes, some into socioeconomic deprivation, some into a combination. I mean, what do you make of the disparity issue on the death rate?
Yeah, I think, look, we know that some illnesses are have a higher rate. So, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis have a higher rate of heart disease. There's more diabetes. If you're 6 times more likely to get it if you're from a Black and ethnic minority background. But I think it'd be lazy for us just to leave it at that and not say, well, what role do socio-economic factors play in health outcomes and the prevalence of these diseases? What has racism contributed to overcrowded houses, ill health, poorer housing, lack of just generally to lifestyle, and having people from a poorer socio-economic background having to work more precarious jobs. I think there's so much behind it and so much that contributes to it. I feel we can't just put it down to, is it just vitamin D deficiency or hypertension or diabetes, but look at what other factors play a role in the prevalence of these illnesses and overcrowding and things like that. And even things like the messaging from the government to Black and ethnic minority communities. Was it adequate? Was it in different languages? Was it targeting all communities and all populations? I think there are multiple factors that play into this. It's a huge minefield.
Because there is a strategy how public health messages need to go, especially to ethnic minorities, isn't there?
Yeah.
That's where there's certainly a need to actually explore and see which are the most effective ways. Because just because someone says you should do it doesn't mean someone who perhaps has a very limited interaction with their primary care support or the secondary services would actually abide by it. They may not actually have members of the family who are from that kind of field who can disseminate information either. So I think the way public health messages are dispensed, I think there needs to be a lot of work done on that.
I mean, I'm part of an organization called ASDOC, and we look to breaking barriers and making sure healthcare is accessible for everyone, even those from Black and ethnic minority communities and Asian communities, and making sure that that the barriers to healthcare are completely broken down. So, for example, when the government released advice around shielding, around social distancing, around basic measures that you need to do to keep yourself safe during the pandemic, we actually translated and made videos of all that advice in different languages, everything from French to Arabic to Bangladeshi to Urdu, and circulated it across social media to make sure that the messaging is reaching the people actually that are most at risk. Because unless you watch the 5 o'clock briefing every day and you get a chance to watch that, or you've gone on the internet and actively looked to see what the advice is and what it means to you, or gone on the government website, how do you get that information? And it isn't just about Black and ethnic minorities. Is it reaching inner city people that live in inner city areas? My patients, if I was to ask my patients, do they understand the advice being given to them by the government? Many of them are completely confused.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, Simon. I think we were discussing off air that previously that people were being asking the UK government to include a sign language interpreter in its daily press briefing, and obviously that came in later on. So I think that was back in. So not all deaf people can understand English, and so in terms of diversity and inclusion, that was a change that was made in terms of the briefings. I think that brings us nicely onto the concept of diversity and inclusion. I mean, what kind of things do you understand that to mean, and what do you think the audience should understand by these terms, diversity and inclusion?
I think the diversity, I think sometimes it's a very difficult terms to. I mean, what have you guys heard in terms of diversity and inclusion?
So
I like it. It's throwing back the question on us.
Well, isn't it? So one of us is doing all the talking. I felt it only fair, to share the time on air. So absolutely.
No, I think the way I see it, but obviously feel free to correct me. I know you have much more experience on this. Is getting a range of different thoughts and opinions on the matter, diversity in that sense. So that's not necessarily ethnicity, although I think that is important. But in terms of gender, ethnicity, maybe faith beliefs or lack of faith belief, and also maybe other different lifestyle sort of measures that people have taken or choices. So that would be part of the diversity, and inclusion is obviously bringing them.
So hang on. So what you're saying for diversity is it isn't just about ethnicity. It can just mean it's a whole spectrum of things. Yeah.
We're talking about language. We're talking about education. We're talking about sexual orientation. We're talking about abilities, disabilities. It's the full package, really.
Yeah, that's it. And then the inclusion, I'd say it was basically, but not just inviting them to the party, but letting them dance as well, as a famous phrase goes. So basically, you're invited, but you're also included in the actual meet as well, and the actual event. So that's the including part. But happy to change my mind on that if there's a different understanding.
No, I think it sounds about right. I mean, see, I've got it quite basic, as in the diversity is the how, and the inclusive. So the diversity is the what, Yeah, so what is it? What are the measures? And the inclusivity is the how. So how are you going to implement those measures? So you can say, you know, we've got a diverse workforce. So we accommodate for, say, people with disabilities, for people from ethnic backgrounds. But then the inclusivity part is, well, how do you do that? You know, what policies have you got in place? What measures do you have in the workforce for those from ethnic backgrounds or with disabilities and so on? So that's how I think the two marry up. So it's the what and the how, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think that there's been a lot of debate whether it's just a fad, having a diverse workforce, for example. Is it just, you know, a tick box exercise, or is there benefit? But I do think, especially businesses and lots of areas within the public as well as private sector, having those different perspectives add quality, adds creativity, adds innovation. And I think if you can marry all that up, it actually improves decision making. So I think there's lots of benefits of having that kind of diversity. But you know, whether it happens or not, that's another question.
Yeah, I think diversity is more, it's showing that representation, isn't it? But the inclusion is more how you make the diversity part of your workforce. How do you actually incorporate it practically on a day-to-day kind of level? Whereas diversity is more like, you know, I've got, no, it's not a tick box, but you know, I've got the tick the boxes, I've got a diverse workforce, but how you actually practically implementing that is very different.
Yeah, I think the Equality Act of 2010 perhaps has helped some of the employing organizations and the individuals, so that they know that they will have the protected characteristics, and maybe that should have helped focus the mind. But I think there's many structures that still have a long way to go in actually doing what equality and diversity is to what it's, so it's meaningful. I think for instance the NHS, I think there's been many reports, we know a lot more about the NHS now during this pandemic. 44% are from the BME background, and I think at the beginning it was 90 or 95% doctors who had died were from the BME background. So I think these things, they're images and numbers which won't leave my mind or many minds at the moment, and it's really how included is that community in all the decision making that's been going on. I mean, do you have any thoughts about how we can include people in the decision making or get them into these leadership positions?
I think recently we saw with the PHE inquiry, they released their findings, and they did have stakeholder events where they did listen to, you know, BAME communities, doctors, and so on, to give their kind of opinions and how they feel that things need to be. But now that the recommendations have been made, I think it's important to include people from a BAME background and ensure that they are part of the recommendations being implemented, and use those voices to help form or bring those recommendations to life. What we can't have again is, you know, having lots of data on race disparity and about ethnic minorities, but actually we don't take any action. We keep bringing out the data. We've had lots of reports. We had the Theresa May did the race disparity audit. Yeah, you know, Lamy did his report. There've been so many reports about ethnic minorities, we need to now use those communities and make them feel like, not just make them feel, but include them and involve them in making the change happen. Not just, you know, listening at the time when we do the audit, but actually involving them in making the change happen.
Yeah, I think NHS trusts do have that equality, diversity, and inclusion, groups, don't they? And I think that offers an avenue for people to raise concerns. I think, as you said at the beginning, Simon, I think people need to learn to speak out. If they see injustice, they have to correct it, not just for themselves, but people around them. And I do think, you know, there's certainly some aspects of personality traits that we need to think about whether we need to develop, because I think there's a lot of information about BME, whether it's about job security, income security, and that leads them to make decisions perhaps they wouldn't have made given the current climate. So, there's a need there, but on the background of it all boils down to education early life opportunities, development, social deprivation, health inequalities, and that kind of further develops and manifests into some of these problems later on in life.
And I keep bringing it back to, we're responsible. I know, you know, I'm a parent, obviously. I think I know definitely one of you is. I don't know about the other one, but we have a responsibility to teach our children about being able to speak out when there is injustice, because there is, and by example show them that we are doing it as well, because unless we start making the change happen at that age and teaching them and explaining to them about all the things that are happening in the world, the change won't be long term. It'll be a very short term change, and then we'll be back to square one again.
Yeah. That's good. I think we want to go to a break soon, Simon, if that's okay with you. We generally have one at midway, but before that, there is a question that we want to take. The listeners have been writing in and leaving messages. So if you're happy to take this, what advice would Dr. Siema give to someone who is being racially targeted at work but doesn't have the confidence to speak out? What should they do?
I mean, obviously, the first thing I would say is raise it at work. Please speak to someone at work and try and bring it to the forefront. There must be, if you can't raise it with, say, what we would say your line manager, there must be somebody at work who you can raise it with, a HR department, somebody that you can go to raise concerns. If there really isn't, and I don't know, obviously, what workplace we're talking about, there are organizations that can help you depending on what sort of discrimination you're facing. I mean, my kind of expertise is around Islamophobia, and I know there are organizations out there that if you're struggling with like Islamophobia, discrimination in the workplace, that there are organizations that will help you challenge what is happening. So I think the first port of call would be to kind of raise it at work. If you can't do that, to an organization that can help you to do that. And this might, I mean, I know as a GP, people will come to me and I can signpost them to say other people, like Citizens Advice can help a lot in these situations. And other organizations, usually local community organizations. If you've got an advice center, sometimes you have lawyers that will come and sit for free, do pro bono work and give advice as well. So, and if you're part of a union, that's important as well, to use, you know, to go to your union and speak to them about your concerns and what's happening. And it may be that when you do speak out, that there are others that are actually experiencing what you are, and you're not on your own, but they've been too afraid to speak out as well. So just, you know, I wish I could help you more, to be honest, but that's the advice that I can generically give at this moment.
Fine. So hopefully we can go to a break then. And then coming back, we've got Dr. Siema Iqbal, GP with us.
And you guys.
So let's all catch up with you very shortly soon after the break. Thank you so much.
Okay. And welcome everybody for the second half to our show. We've been blessed to have Dr. Siema Iqbal, GP in Greater Manchester, but clearly we've been touching on a very important topic on racism, discrimination and inequality. I think we have gone through various definitions. Something I think we've perhaps missed the opportunity to elaborate on a little bit more, just about what is exactly equality. And as Faheem mentioned before, it's based on the Equal Opportunities and Discriminations Act, and it does cover various set of protected characteristics, and these include age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage, pregnancy, race, religion, sex, orientation. So all those things are very much central to that. So should anyone have difficulties and feel that they are being targeted because of those specific characteristics, there's every reason to speak out. But clearly, as some of the issues that were raised earlier, speak to someone, speak to your line manager, or whoever the responsible person would be. But if you feel uncomfortable, there are opportunities in the community and other public services that can support you in that. So the next phase of our discussion is going to be a little bit more about prejudice and discrimination. Faheem, you introduced the term microaggression Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I wanted to discuss this evening. The concept of microaggression, it may be different things. And I think it came to light again recently in the news where there were apologies. I don't know, Simon, if you saw Aberdeen University, they had to apologize for what was perceived as discrimination against their black students that had been going on over several years. And the examples that they used, some of the students were saying, people commenting on the way they do their hair or other things that maybe just off the cuff comments or that they make, but it can unsettle them. So sometimes it's, not saying their name, but basically missing them out and not trying to pronounce their name, different things. So microaggressions, but things as in small, as in what micro suggests, but when they build up over time, obviously they become big. I mean, Simon, what's your experience of seeing or actually hearing about things like microaggression in the workplace or even outside the workplace?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned earlier that I haven't really experienced any discrimination or racism during my training, but I think microaggressions is slightly more different. So you will, and I've even had microaggression from patients, which is a little bit of a surprise. Things like, oh, I didn't think you'd have a Manchester accent. I clearly have quite a strong Manchester accent. Or wow, I didn't think, just even if it's to do with gender, I didn't think it was going to be a female doctor. I didn't think, women. In fact, one person said, I didn't think women were allowed to work, in your kind of, really just. And I think sometimes it can be subconscious bias. I don't think it's always intentional, if that makes sense. Conscious bias, I think it can be subconscious. And it's a learned behavior, I think, from what they've seen from when they were young or growing up, and it's just innately there. And that's what I mean by when we think about, you've got to think about your own prejudices as well. When we're talking about even Black Lives Matter, you have to explore yourselves, and that applies to us as well, about looking at our internal prejudices and how your behavior over the years, and I'll say this for myself as well, may kind of show how I treat others. And I think that's where you sometimes see microaggressions coming out.
I think I can potentially add to that. Say, for example, if I had a conversation with someone who I met for the first time that asked me where you're from, and I'd say, well, I'm British.
Yeah, this is a common one.
But,
yeah.
Yeah, no, but where are you really from?
Where are you really from? It's a really, yeah. Where are you really from? Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't really matter where I'm really from, but I guess from what I said should be sufficient for us to continue that conversation. But once you become into my inner circle, then we can obviously talk and go out and have a kebab or whatever. But yeah, so it's just another example of microaggression that perhaps some people can relate to.
Yeah, and I think it depends, how people actually either brush it off or tackle it. There's two different ways, isn't there, with these things? Like, that's a very good example, Mehran, the where are you from? I think for some people, it's just a way to build rapport, to actually say, oh yeah, you're from this part of England or something like that. But for some others, and this is where it's difficult, it may be a bit more of a sinister motive, and it's to try and other you, as in, well, maybe Mehran, you're an immigrant. Okay, and let's put that on the table and make sure you know your place in society. So I think and that's the difficulty, Simon, with some of these interactions. They're not very long. We don't have their full history in terms of all of their context and background as to what is the meaning or ulterior motive. I mean, do you have any ideas, Simon, how we should we tackle them or brush them off? I mean, what's
I think
your
it's important to tackle them. If you sometimes you get, oh, your name's so hard to pronounce. It's actually not. It's really straightforward and easy, but they have to make something out of it to say, well, you're different. That's why your name's really hard to pronounce, or you have things like, you're in the wrong room. This isn't for you. This meeting's not for you. I've had that in the past as well. Well, actually it is. And I am a doctor or whatever. So I think unless you tackle it, it will continue because you have to challenge the behavior. So even if it's subconscious bias, the person needs to know that they have a behavior or they've said something that you've not liked, and you're allowed to say, I don't like that, or can I correct you on that? Because in a way it educates them if they didn't know any better, and hopefully stops them from doing it to someone else. But I think if we brush it off, it will continue and it will happen, and it will continually start happening. And again, if they have children, that learned behavior will get passed on, and nothing ever changes. And this is where I feel like we are at this pivotal moment in history now where things have to change. They really do. I think 2020 is the year for it.
Absolutely.
That was my inspiring little motivational speech. It's been such a crazy, awful year. Something positive has to come out of all of this. You know, it has to come out of it, because there has to be change. This is a new. I aspire that this is going to be the new normal: a racism, discrimination, prejudice-free society with everyone, equality for all, and we can hopefully.
Yeah, no, you certainly hit the nail on the head. I think something feels very different about where we are today with what's happening with regards to Black Lives Matter and the subsequent repercussions and the ripple effects. I hope, sincerely hope, that this leads to a genuine degree of engagement and the kind of sustained persistence. As you said, we know of this. We've known this for decades. But it's just about actually having that leadership and that shared responsibility to say, you know what, enough is enough. Let's try understand each other. Let's listen to each other. But at the same time, be fair, be just to not just one segment of the community, but the community as a whole.
Do you know, when I used to do, I did a lot of work around Islamophobia, and people will, and I often say, look, you know, right now the room is on fire. Okay, for Islamophobia, the Muslim community is being affected. That is the room that's on fire. And you know, you can use this analogy for Black Lives Matter. And but that fire is going to spread. It's going to go to other rooms. So unless we put that fire out right now in this room, it's going to affect us all. So we have to tackle this in a societal way. It isn't just like Islamophobia isn't just for the Muslim community to tackle. Black Lives Matter isn't just for the Black community to tackle. We've all got to put these fires out and work together, because it will spread to the next room and the next room unless we put it out properly now.
Absolutely. And I think it's important when you mentioned this, and the fire, I think in the past, the Baroness Wolsey talks about Islamophobia passing the dinner table test, where it was actually acceptable for some households to talk about it. And there's all these different movements. There was the Me Too movement. Obviously, you needed men as well to help women to get over that. In the same way, it should be simple, shouldn't it, for non-Black society to try and actually help the Black society in some way? Simon, shouldn't it really be straightforward in that way?
It should, and I think this concept of us, we're having to work together, but there's always othering. And I know, you know, when I said earlier about the messaging from the government has to reach all communities, including Black and ethnic minority communities, and the messaging has to be in different languages. And I remember saying this previously in an interview, and the amount of trolling I got on Twitter for saying, well, why should we put things in other languages for other communities? Why should the messaging have to change? We live in England. But this again boils down to the same thing, that we have to work together as a society as one, because if the messaging is getting to all communities, it means everyone understands social distancing. It means as a result, everybody is safer. And this is what people need to understand, that the reason that we have to work together is to keep us all safe.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
We do have a question from Amjad in Pendle. He has said, we as BME communities have lived here for around 60 years. Why do we still have the same issue of communicating information to BME communities from various agencies, hospitals, government, etc.? So I think he continues to talk about the way the messages are shared through to the communities. Why do you think that's the case?
Is he trying to say that the messaging should be sent out in different languages to everyone?
Yeah, I think from what I read it as, why is it still an issue that people need to be told to put it into the different, why is it not happening?
Why is it automatically done?
Yeah, why is it not an automatic? Yeah, I think that's the way.
In an ideal world, it should be automatically done. We should be, thinking about everyone when we think about our communities, because it is such a diverse country. But I think until we keep, if we just let it happen each time and don't say anything and just let it slide, things will never change. This is where we have to say, look, your messaging needs to go out to everyone. whatever it is, whether it's a smear invite letter, whether it's a, you know, hospital letter, if we don't raise, it's about raising your voices as a community and saying, look, we need this in alternative languages, or we need information more accessible. How do we work to make sure that happens, whether it's working with your MP, whether it's working with local health authorities or local councils? You have to actually actively go and make the change happen. It isn't going to happen unless you show that there's a problem, because unless you speak out and say there is a problem with this, we need X, Y, Z, and here's how we can help you achieve it, it will never change.
Absolutely. I guess partly as well, a lot of this is touching on modernity as well, Simon. And I know, Mehran, I think I told you about it when I read this article last year in the Sunday Times, and there was a bit of an acid test that they did to try and ask because it was pre-election. He's already laughing. He knows that's coming. And it was a question of modernity, and they asked the person who was a white female and said, you know, when was the last time you invited someone who was black for dinner or non-white? And they were like, and they said, okay, forget dinner. How about just for coffee to your house? And they were like, and basically the silence was overpowering. And then they said, well, I did go to, you know, enter name of a famous chicken franchise. And there was someone of a different ethnicity there present, not in their group. So I guess what I'm trying to say, I mean, at the time, that was not to do with the Black Lives Matter when I first brought it up back in November. But now we can marry that into the Black Lives Matter movement, and the concept is, well, actually, I'm 7 months down the line. And is that question just as valid then as it is now?
I would say it is. I'm assuming you're asking me that question. Yeah, I would say that it is. But I think it applies to all of us. I think if we're going to be honest, I think we need to look at that ourselves as well. Like, those questions apply to us as well. So I think we do need to be quite honest and transparent about that and say, you know, again, if we're going to work as a society, all of these questions apply to all of us.
And that was my argument to Faheem on that late night.
Was it? Right, okay. Yeah. I had no idea. Okay, I'm on this side even.
It was a good discussion.
Yeah, you could call it an acid test, but at the same time, what does it actually mean? It doesn't mean that someone is, just kind of racially profiling who they interact with or having that kind of clear prejudice. Sometimes because of our interactions or limited number of interactions, we subconsciously kind of pigeonhole or categorize certain individuals, don't we? And perhaps we don't get the opportunities to engage, have those discussions. But I do know from our kind of MEDtalkx conversations, and we've had such a diverse mix of people, and I think that's important. And I think if we think about our own kind of prejudice and discriminations from our kind of cultural perspective, there's enough there to potentially focus on, in addition to everything else that's out there in the community.
But then on the flip side, I'm going to say, look, you know, if we're doing the acid test, when is the last time I had someone from the Black community round for dinner? It's probably been a while. I do, because I've got quite a diverse set of people that I mix with. But just because I don't, does that mean that I am prejudiced? So, like, you know, it doesn't mean that just because you've not interacted with them over coffee or dinner, so long as you're not discriminating against people, I think that's the crux. You know, you could have them over for dinner and still discriminate against them at work. So I think this is where you've got to think of the other side. Look, so long as you do not discriminate against or treat people unfairly or hold them back or prevent them from progressing in the workplace based on their race or age or sex or whatever, it doesn't mean you have to have them over for dinner. Just having them over for dinner doesn't mean you're not racist.
No.
Then it comes into the, well, you know, I'm not racist because I've got a Black friend, whatever. Exactly. And now it's like, I've had someone around for dinner. Well, yeah, you might have done, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think we had a really long discussion over it. There are many reasons why someone may not invite someone else, maybe just the familiarity, different interests, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it was a good opening question that led to discussion on the concept of modernity, what it means to be modern, living in the modern world 2020. And it makes you think that's what it does. And you're right.
But then you're entering what is modern, what is one person's modern, and the moral compass of society changes all the time. That varies, and how much of modernity is affected by your faith and your beliefs, and it's quite philosophical for like 9 o'clock in the evening on a Tuesday.
I have to dig that article up for you, Simon.
Bit of bedtime reading tonight.
And that's the challenge of people of faith, isn't it? I guess it's not exclusive to people of faith, but just some people have that kind of moral compass, or speak from a specific religion, where things are quite clear cut, but obviously the environment around them changes. But I think that's where equality, diversity, inclusion should allow the different opinions to coexist. But as long as that
you're
doesn't
doing no
lead
harm.
to being at harm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Well, we're entering into last 5 minutes. This is normally a time when we always ask our guests for their 3 top tips that people can leave away with. And hopefully, Simon, we've got some tips that you can give our listeners and viewers on the concept of racism, inequality, and just what they can do to maybe prevent it where they are and actively oppose it, to be quite proactive in the Black Lives Movement and so on. Maybe just a few top tips that we can leave with, actual practical points from tonight's show.
I think one of them is, if you are in a workplace, please make sure that if you say, I'm a partner in a practice, and I make sure, I hope I do, if anyone from work is listening, let me know otherwise, that there is a safe space for concerns from people from all ethnic minorities, Black, Asian, whatever, to raise those concerns without any fear or discrimination or prejudice. And I think if there isn't, and you realize there isn't in your workplace, be the one that makes that happen. Challenge it. Find out where people can go if they've got concerns, and how you can create that safe space. I think that's really important. Number 2, I'm going to say protest. Literally protest. I know some people are very anti-protest, but I think sometimes to make your voice heard, you have to go out there on the streets physically and protest, and you can see the difference. You've seen it with Black Lives Matter, what's happening, the difference that a protest can make. And the last point I'm going to say is, and I think I'm saying this as a parent, and I'll keep saying it is so important that you teach your children about everything that's happening in the world, about discrimination, about prejudice, about, when it comes to even teaching them about history, make sure that they're having a balanced education, and they're learning everything, not just what's taught to them, but make sure they're getting a balanced overview of what's happened in the past, and talk to them about discrimination. And I can't emphasize it enough, to be honest. I think because if we don't educate the next generation coming through, all the changes we're making now, and it might be that in our lifetime we don't see the changes of all these protests and all the demos and the activism and everything, we might be just laying the seeds of foundation, and it'll be the next generation or the generation after that where you see the differences and you see a more equal and fair society. It might not happen in my lifetime, and I'm okay with that, so long as I've set the seeds in motion to make sure it happens at some point. And I do that by educating the next generation and the generation after that.
It's really good.
It's quite
what
deep,
about you?
isn't it?
Yeah.
Matt Shafi.
No,
He's going to come out with real practical points now. Yeah.
No, I think it was important because you mentioned the protest, and I know some years ago there was an event from protest to engagement, and then one of the speakers said, "Well, engagement protests can be a form of engagement. So I think it's looking at that and the paradigm shift of obviously protests seen sometimes negatively, but they shouldn't be necessarily. They can be a force for action, positivity, and real force for change, like the Black Lives Movement. I mean, there is the issue obviously here with social distancing and so on, and that's really come into the fore, which didn't used to exist in previous protests. But there must be ways that all of this can be continued safely for everyone as well. And a lot of people I know, they've been explaining this as the more important pandemic, haven't they? They've used language like that. So I think really thank you, Siema, for trying to explain those points to the audience. It's been really good. And it's been really an honor having you. I know you're a role model, not just in our community, in the Muslim community, in so many different communities that you represent. So thank you for coming on again as well this evening.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Hopefully I'll be back. I might be back. Might be.
Of course. I'd love to have you back.
With an even more controversial topic.
Well, I'm glad you led on to that, didn't you?
But I do agree that protests can take various forms, as long as we try to stick within the kind of health paradigms, as well as within the law that exists, so that you get the message across safely, but nevertheless make sure when the message is sent, it's deafening, so that people hear. I guess that's the key thing. I think I do think people need to be leaders. I know we try to be as leaders, whether it's as parents or children, or whether it's in the work or in the community. Everyone's trying to do what they can with the limited resource being time. I guess that's a key thing, isn't it? To try and support who we can. But culture is important, but at the same time, the similarities in culture, I just hope it doesn't create barriers to create that inclusivity with other members of our community. So I do think that need to support one another in a general sense is probably the way forward. So I think lots of deep philosophical discussions on a Tuesday.
Can I just say one thing that is really simple, right? Is that do something. Nothing is too small a thing to do. Whether it is you stick a Facebook status up, you don't know who you're going to touch with what you've written or what you've shared or knowledge you've imparted. Whether you read a book, whether you listen to a podcast, whether you sign a petition, just please don't do nothing. That's it. Do something. It doesn't matter how small. You will be amazed at how much difference a small. If everyone does something small, will create a massive change.
What a way to finish. Yeah, it's fully great. I just want to round up the show then, really. And once again, thank you. Big thanks to Siema for coming tonight. And just reiterate that this has been MEDtalkx on Awaz 103.1 FM. And Mehran, do you want to tell us what we're doing next week?
Yeah, so we've got Ishan Akbar, our long-lost brother and comedian. You may have seen him on Mock the Week, so it was just a fascinating, interaction. So I look forward to having him on next week. So please stay tuned. But same time, same place on Tuesday, 8 to 9. So hopefully see you all then. Take care, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good night. Thank you, Siema.